Hi, welcome to Exploring Sunday Scriptures for October the 12th. If we look at scriptures that we will have as part of worship this coming Sunday, the 17th of October. We continue with the discipline of the lectionary, which uses a cycle of scriptures from Old Testament, New Testament, and Gospel, as well as Psalm, as a way of encouraging us as a community of faith to read through the majority of the Bible over the course of 3 years. So we have a story from God's journey with the Hebrew people, what we call the Old Testament, a story of the early church. We call it the New Testament or the epistles of Paul particularly, but other parts of the New Testament as well, like we will be reading from Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews. And the gospel, the story of course, Jesus and his life and teaching and ministry. The psalm I use as the call to worship. So it's just to familiarize us with the songbook, the ancient songbook that is part of our canon of scriptures. I apologize that this is coming out a little later than usual, in that with the day off yesterday, Indigenous Persons Day, it's just kind of put things behind. We had quite a few things to catch up with here at the church office, and so I'm just now getting this up. So I apologize if you were looking for it this morning and didn't find it on Tuesday. I hope you found your way back to it and can now incorporate this into your preparations for Sunday by listening to these scriptures now and then returning to them again a couple of times throughout the week. So we've been with Job now for the past 2 weeks, and we continue with Job. So we started off in the first chapter, which sort of laid out the cosmic play, the divine play between God and evil that was taking place in the life of Job, to see if Job could be swayed from his faith and dedication to God. We picked that up way later last week in the 23rd chapter. So we skipped from the first chapter to way deep in the journey with Job, where he was looking for God, sort of amid all of the calamity that was happening with him and how people were speaking to him and interacting with him. He sort of was reaching out to God saying, "Where are you? Where are you? Where are you? I've been steadfast. I can lay my case before you and how I've been faithful. Where are you? Because everywhere I look, I can't find you, and I'm in need of you." And now we pick up all the way in the 38th verse. So we've skipped another 10 plus chapters to get to the 38th verse. This makes it hard to feel like we really sequentially are following the story of Job when we really have these big gaps between them. But what the lectionary again tries to do is to move us as much as it can through the majority of the Bible, through the majority, or at least having some part of the stories of the Bible highlighted to us, to perhaps encourage us to explore more fully each of these stories. So to go back and to read all of Job and to get a sense as to what it's about and all that befalls Job. The other thing the lectionary tries to do at times is to coordinate a theme between the readings. So when possible, as much as there is sequential readings, like we will have in the Gospel particularly, but even in the Hebrews reading, is there a common theme that can be found which can tie together the readings, allowing us to hear sort of the truth that weaves through the entire narrative of Scripture? So can we find that truth that is present through all of them? Now, I babbled enough. Let me get on to the scriptures as I've done in the past. I will read these in 2 different translations, provide a little bit of insight or reflection on them before moving on to the other scriptures, just to give you a tiny bit of exposure and preparation for Sunday morning. So the 38th chapter of Job, the first 7 verses, I'm going to read from the New Revised Standard Version, which is the version that we have in the Bibles that are in the pews here at Christ Church. And then I will read from the Message version. The Message just provides kind of contemporary language and sometimes can help breathe more or new meaning out of these passages. So I choose it because of sometimes just how different it is from something that tries to be accurate and true of the original language. In this case, the Old Testament, this would be Hebrew, biblical Hebrew. So if we remember last week, Job said, "I look to the north, I look to the south. God, where are you? I want to put my case before you." And here's where we pick up. So it's almost like you could put the two together in a linear way or in a chronological way, even though we have multiple chapters between last week's and this week's. But here's this week's. It's God's reply. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together? And all the heavenly beings shouted for joy. And here's the Message, which has a few more verses. I'm going to try to find a way to coordinate this so it corresponds. And now finally God answered Job from the eye of a violent storm. He said, why do you confuse the issue? Why do you talk without knowing what you're talking about? Pull yourself together, Job, up on your feet, stand tall. I have some questions for you, and I want some straight answers. Where were you when I created the earth? Tell me, since you know so much. Who decided on its size? Certainly you'll know that. Who came up with the blueprints and measurements? How was its foundation poured? And who set the cornerstone? While the morning stars sang in chorus, and all the angels shouted praise. So this in some ways is trying to respond to Job's questions, which have posited sort of his knowledge and his wisdom here, that God is trying to say, okay, smarty pants, you think you know so much, so answer me the following questions. So this is once again providing sort of the right formula for faith of Job. You need to put your faith in the right place and remember where wisdom comes from and the things that you know and the things that you don't know. And that, I think, is an important facet of understanding our limitations and understanding wisdom and knowledge, is to know what we know, but to also acknowledge what we do not know. And I think that's very hard for us in our current time. We have so much availability of information. Whether that information is correct or not, we have information constantly at our fingertips. We can easily search things and find answers. And so we can confuse that then with wisdom and thinking that we can answer any query we have. This is trying to expose certain things that couldn't be answered by Job. Maybe we have more scientific answers to some of these questions now, but there are still questions that have outstanding answers that we can't get to the bottom of. And this is where we really rely upon or lean upon God, that God is the source of wisdom, that God is the source of truth, that God is the source of knowledge. So in this case, it's who determines the size of the earth. So who in creation made this place in which the habitat and the inhabitants such that it could afford life to exist? Is that something that Job is capable of answering? Does he know exactly the measurements of the earth? Now, at that time, he wouldn't have known the measurements of the earth. This is one of those things that maybe we can say we can now measure the earth. And then we go into the cornerstone and the morning stars singing and stuff like that. But it's really trying to say, understand what you can know and what you can't know, or what you do know and what you do not know, and understand that God does know everything. The other interesting thing that I know tickled my ears a little bit is I read this. It's very typical in the Old Testament that the encounters with God are, I don't know what word to use, kind of ethereal, or in some type of natural phenomenon as it is described, and we tend to attribute it, but it's like trying to describe something indescribable. So the experience of hearing the voice of God in this case is talked about being answered out of a whirlwind or the eye of a violent storm. Now, what's interesting in thinking about the eye of a violent storm is if we take the eye of a hurricane, if you listen to firsthand accounts, the eye of a hurricane is incredibly still and silent, which is how God also ends up speaking to Elijah in the still small voice, in this quietness. It's almost spooky after you've gone through something so violent and extreme, such as hurricanes or tornadoes, to then have this moment where there is no sound at all, nothing at all. And maybe it takes the absence of sound for us to really hear God's wisdom or God's voice speak to us. So to compare it, as the Message does, with the eye of a violent storm, to me has a lot of resonance with quieting our lives enough so that we actually can hear God. Has Job been so busy talking, and asking God, where are you? I can't find you anywhere. And other people talking at him. And are we so distracted ourselves with everything that talks at us, the constant messaging that comes at us and that we have access to, that also we need to be stripped bare like a storm does, stripped bare so that in the silence that follows, we're finally capable or exposed enough to be able to hear God. Let me shift over to the New Testament. This continues in Hebrews, and this is the 5th chapter. So we're pretty much picking up right where we left off with Hebrews. It's a little bit longer of a reading than our Old Testament reading of those 7 verses. This is Hebrews 5, verses 1 through 10. And I'll read the 2 versions, NRSV and then the Message. Every high priest chosen from among mortals is put in charge of things pertaining to God on their behalf, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is subject to weakness. And because of this, he must offer sacrifice for his own sins, as well as for those of the people. And one does not presume to take this honor, but takes it only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest, but was appointed one by the one who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, having been designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. All right, now let's listen to the Message and see if it helps us in understanding. Every high priest selected to represent men and women before God and offer sacrifices for their sins should be able to deal gently with their failings, since he knows what it's like from his own experience. But that also means that he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as the people's. No one elects himself to this honored position. He's called to it by God, as Aaron was. Neither did Christ presume to set himself up as high priest, but was set apart by the one who said to him, "You're my son, today I celebrate you." In another place, God declares, "You're a priest forever in the royal order of Melchizedek." While he lived on earth anticipating death, Jesus cried out in pain and wept in sorrow as he offered up priestly prayers to God. Because he honored God, God answered him. Though he was God's son, he learned trusting obedience by what he suffered, just as we do. Then, having arrived at the full stature of his maturity and having been announced by God as high priest in the order of Melchizedek, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who believingly obey him. All right, so to share with you some of what we find in this passage from Hebrews, and it can sound confusing when we have things like in the order of Melchizedek. This is not something that we're familiar with, that Jesus himself ever says in relation to the Gospels and to the story and teachings of Jesus, the miracles of Jesus that we find in the Gospels. Part of what we need to remember is the context of Hebrews itself, which helps shine a light on what we generally find throughout this writing that's here. This is a community of faith that's being written to, that's on some shaky ground, or they've gotten to a place where they've sort of plateaued in their faith journey and maybe are even having a bit of a crisis. And as the author writes to this community of faith, one of the important aspects that is brought out, this may be an early Jewish Christian audience in the sense of Jewish converts to Christianity, to create the connections between the story of God's journey with the Hebrew people, what we typically call the Old Testament, and how Jesus is related into that story, as well as the order, the law, the prophets, the things that are part of that story and part of the important parts of the culture. And so when we find here, and I'm going to pick up on this using particularly the Message version, every high priest selected to represent men and women before God and offer sacrifices for their sins, so this is for other people's sins, for men's and women's sins, should be able to deal gently with their failings, with other men and women's sins, since those who are appointed know what it's like from their own experience, because they too have sinned. But that also means that they have to offer sacrifices for their own sins, as well as the men and women to whom they've been appointed to serve. So this is saying, if you are appointed a priest, not only do you go to God to offer sacrifices on behalf of the people so that there can be grace and forgiveness in that, but you go there adding your own sacrifices as well, because you are human and you have sinned as well. It continues. Nobody says, ooh, I want to do this, because you have to face that mirror. You have to look into it. Actually, it comes from a unique divine call. Now, here is the appeal into that storied reality of God's journey with the Hebrew people, as Aaron was. So this is linking Christ with this lineage of serving as a priest, of going to God in order to offer the sacrifices for others' sins in order to have them forgiven, just as Aaron was. And that's when we transition then to Christ. So it's linking Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, in with Aaron. And the other link is this order of Melchizedek, which was the royal order or lineage of priesthood. So it's a funny sounding formal name, but it's intended to create a link, an uninterrupted link from Aaron through the order of Melchizedek to Jesus, that these are all part of the same link. This link is into this priestly function, which is not something that is human nominated, but something that comes as a call from God, and the duties of which are to provide sacrifices so that forgiveness, so that grace can flow from God to the people. Now, the difference between Aaron or any of the others that served in the royal order of Melchizedek is that Jesus did this same function to God and was obedient to God and suffered just like we do, but he had no sin himself to blend in with the sacrifices that he was offering to God on behalf of all, because he was sinless. So though he is in this lineage with Aaron and the order of Melchizedek, the difference is he is sinless. And so it becomes the perfect offering before God, whereby no other sacrifices are needed to be made before God. It became the source of eternal salvation to all who believingly obey him. So where this will continue is sort of, what does it mean to obey Jesus then? What does it mean to follow the words of Jesus? I'm sorry, I've just got to find out. There we go. Keep my pages in order here. Our last reading, to try to keep us within our 30-minute mark here, is from Mark, the Gospel of Mark, which is the gospel for this lectionary year that we are in, year B. And this picks up right where we left off last time. So that was the rich man who ran up to Jesus, said, "What must I do?" And Jesus says, "You need to go sell everything." And he says, "Whoa, it's too much." And the disciples struggle with that. And he says, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. That's where we left off. And Peter tries at the end of that, "Well, what about us? We've lost everything." And Jesus says, you have, and you'll gain it back, but you're also going to have a bunch of suffering. Know that the last are going to be first, the first are going to be last. So we've had a whole bunch of readings about children and slaves and other things, and how in God's eyes and in this kingdom that is to come, roles are going to be greatly reversed. That there's going to be a big transition from what is the experience to what will be the experience. And we kind of continue. This doesn't seem to be hitting the mark with the disciples. They still are struggling. They had argued on the road about who was the favorite. And now they're going to be continuing that. So we're in Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 45. Again, I'll read through the two versions, NRSV and the Message. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And Jesus said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We're able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." And now from the Message. James and John, Zebedee's sons, came up to Jesus. "Teacher, we have something we want you to do for us." "What is it? I'll see what I can do." "Arrange it," they said, "so that we will be awarded the highest places of honor in your glory, one of us at your right, the other at your left." Jesus said, "You have no idea what you're asking. Are you capable of drinking the cup that I drink, or being baptized in the baptism I'm about to be plunged into?" "Sure," they said. "Why not?" Jesus said, "Come to think of it, you will drink the cup that I drink and be baptized in my baptism. But as to awarding places of honor, that's not my business. There are other arrangements for that." When the other 10 heard of this conversation, they lost their tempers with James and John. Jesus got them together to settle things down. "You've observed how godless rulers throw their weight around," he said, "and when people get a little power, how quickly it goes to their heads. It's not going to be that way with you. Whoever wants to be great must become a servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. That is what the Son of Man has done. He came to serve, not to be served, and then to give away his life in exchange for many who are held hostage." Interesting things we have afoot here. As I said, this kind of continues in a range of readings that started quite a while ago, where Jesus continues to push home just how different following him is, and how the arrangement of the kingdom of God is different than the arrangement of the things of this world. In this case, we have the Zebedee boys, James and John, who are requesting that Jesus has already begun to speak openly about his death and ultimately the glory that is to come. They've said, hey, so when that occurs, can we sit at your left and right? Now they start by asking, we have something you want to do for us. And Jesus says, he doesn't really say sure, but he says, what is it? Maybe. What do you got? What do you got there? And so they asked to do that. Now, we kind of get back to Job in some ways. Jesus is saying, you need to understand or know what you know and what you don't know. And you don't know what you're asking right now. You do not have the wisdom, the knowledge to understand what it is that you ask. And it's sort of saying, what I am going to face uniquely. And what you are going to face, you are going to face. But you can't face what I'm going to face. And in some ways, perhaps, I don't know that he really says, I can't face what you're going to face. Jesus is with us always, with whatever we face. And maybe that's what he says. Come to think of it, you will. Like we all experience our own ways that we drink the cup that Jesus drank and are baptized in the way into his baptism. If we truly live as he says, whoever wants to be great must become servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Then we will drink that cup. We will be baptized in his baptism. But he really is here saying that in following him, we are really creating an entirely different scenario of what matters and what's important. And positions of power or authority are only things that typically corrupt our human spirits and make us tyrannical, so are misused over others. Only in service to others do we not misuse that. So it's only when we put ourselves beneath others as we help them that we find a way that God becomes present to us, but also through that, we experience what is the kingdom of God, which is our deep connection and need and belonging with one another, which can only happen when we are in relationship, when we are serving and perhaps ourselves also being served. Always interesting to me to have passages that have brothers, because of course I have brothers as well. But this is an interesting passage to continue with in our readings based on its connection with the others that we have had also at this point, with so much about the change of this equation. It seems to be something that can't quite get right, both in our Christian journey and the church, the bureaucratic church, or its expressions in different denominations, as we continue to set up human institutions in ways in which we parse out and how power is used in that parsing out of who is right and who is not, and who is in authority and who is not. Now, some of that is necessary to keep organization and order and things progressing. But I suppose what is called for here is a constant recognition that we are called to be servants. And we have to figure out and constantly check where our hearts and our minds and our actions align, and make sure that they are aligned in with servant ministry and serving others, and not into serving ourselves or our own needs. So if I have to find sort of a thread here, if there is one to find, I guess I would say it's knowing what we know and knowing what we don't know. And from that, understanding that our best experience of growing in our knowledge and experience of God is through service to others, which is only going to broaden our own capacity to know God better, but to also understand what we do not know out there. So a little bit of exposure to our scriptures for this week. I hope this is helpful to have this for you. I do enjoy the challenge of coming before you each week to read through these scriptures, to share a little bit of my own impressions and reflections as I prepare a message for this Sunday. So thank you, as always, truly for joining me for Exploring Sunday Scriptures, and I look forward to seeing you again soon as we explore our next set of scriptures related to our next time that we will worship. God bless you, and may God bless your week.